Well, this week on Buffering, we are thrilled to be joined by Cory Munchbach. Cory described herself as a recovering CEO, which might be my favorite description of how anybody has described themselves coming onto the show. And Cory has held leadership positions at Forrester and most recently was the CEO, or also, as we learned a new term here, CEO, as her husband describes it, at BlueConic. BlueConic is a customer data platform, or CDP, that helped businesses leverage first-party data to create personalized customer journeys. And I feel like this is a conversation that we have a lot on the Buffering podcast. So welcome, Cory. Really excited to have you here.
So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'd love for you just to introduce yourself a little bit, maybe give you a bit more of your background. And I think it would be great as we kick off the conversation today, just to talk a little bit about what a CDP is for our listeners and explain, how you are thinking about data through this customer data platform.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's probably relevant, the fact that I was an analyst at Forrester before I went to BlueConic, and now back on the board at Forrester. There's sort of this interweaving theme of customers and technology and marketing and research and how all of these kind of come together. And so that has been the last 10 years that I was doing that with BlueConic, but really kind of the origin of most of what I've been working on for the last 15 or so. And the technology in question, as you talk about CDP, I think in a lot of ways is a really great example of a tool that kind of represents a lot of trends that we are seeing now, and this ability to have a database of record that is specifically for marketing. One of the things that I'm a very vocal evangelist around is that marketers need tools that are specific to marketing. I don't think that you can take things that were meant for IT necessarily and just say, here you go, marketing, this is now for you. Marketers have very specific day-to-day practical needs, and tools that are designed for use are really important. So a CDP is an example of that. So think about it as a database that has all kinds of consumer data in it, or customer data, depending on what industry you're in. If you're a shopper, subscriber, reader, whatever we're describing here. And the specificity of marketing really is about a couple of things. One is it's got to be in as close to real time as possible. When someone's on your website, you cannot wait 5 minutes or 15 minutes or a day to come back and realize, oh, that was Cory visiting my website. That doesn't work. So that need for speed is a big part of it. Another is being able to bridge data from when someone is anonymous. Again, a first-time web browser, someone on a mobile app, somebody coming to you perhaps through different channels where you just simply can't identify them as who they are. But you also don't want to lose sight of who they are once you can know them. You don't want to forget who they were when they were anonymous. So that bridging of the known and the unknown. And then the third part that I think is really important here is that the data is really actionable. When we talk about data architectures and tools in a lot of cases, usually the data is really inaccessible. It's like, we'll put in a request and maybe someone 4 weeks from now will send me a list back or something. And there's a lot of disintermediation from the people who need the data from the data itself. And so CDP was designed to solve that for our marketers out there, the doers of the world who really need to be able to bridge that gap in certain ways. And that's been kind of my whole theme around this, is whether you're using a CDP or specifically, but those broader themes of being able to understand who your customers are, how you use that insight to drive business outcomes. That is kind of the stuff that I've been super passionate about for the last 15 years or so.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that problem that you said there around business or people in the business not having access to the data, that's something that Zach and I see really frequently, especially in the broadband service provider space. So much of the data about the customer is trapped in the network. And what you described there of, hey, I've got to put a request in to, somebody over in the network side, and 4 weeks later, I may get a report back. And oh, by the way, that report just has IP addresses and nothing that tells me how to actually get in contact with people. That's a real problem that people deal with every single day. And yes. I love that idea of making sure that the data is in a format that a marketer can actually take direct action with. Because again, that's where a lot of this is going to fall down. Marketers are often data people. Like that's what got me into marketing, was coming out of a finance and accounting background. The data part of it is really what interested me, but they're not data scientists where they're going to be able to pull all of these disparate things together and figure out a way to action it. We need to have it a little bit easier and put into a cleaner package for folks. So I love that
Absolutely.
perspective.
And I think another part that you're talking about, Gabe, that's so critical is not just the data packaging itself, but what you just talked about is the workflows, right? We need to think about, how are you going about your day? What are you goaled on? What are the outcomes that you're supposed to be contributing as a marketing leader or a more hands-on keys marketer? Everybody has a part to play in this workflow within an organization. And if we're not thinking about designing the whole org, sort of the classic people, process, and technology to do this, you can fix one and it's like having beautiful new tires on a car that doesn't have an engine, right? So you need to be thinking about the full composite here. And that's also where some of this becomes really overwhelming and hard, because it isn't just one piece of the puzzle that you're solving for. You really do have to be kind of thinking about it as a system or designing it in that way. And that can be very overwhelming. That can be a lot of change management, right? You really need to take that whole piece on in order for it to have the outsized impact that we know that it really can when it's done really well.
Yeah, great point.
Well, we can jump right into the data part of this conversation too. I know that's something, of course, Gabe and I like talking about as well. In the past, we actually broke down the different types of data that marketers can use in an organization as well. So today I want to talk a little bit about first-party data. And we've also talked in the past, I mentioned that types of data here, zero-party data, where you collect that information from visitors as they view your website. And Gabe, I had to share this example with you from the weekend, but I was looking for new bedding and I came across a landing page here, and the headline was, "Hey, want 15% off?" And the two options for the call to action was yes, which was like a nice big bold button. And instead of saying no, it was just no thanks, I'll pay full price. And I thought that was just a great example of this DTC landing page. Of course, I clicked yes. I gave them, some limited personal information, and there was my discount, of course. One of the cool things we talked about, though, with this specific example just before this podcast was, while cool, there was no urgency behind that landing page. And Cory, I know you had some thoughts on that as well. I'd love to hear those.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think for anything that gets us out of sort of the basic, boring, totally, right? So step one, I love what they did. Make it have a little bit more personality, give a little sense of FOMO, all of that. Where I sort of would say to challenge perhaps is the best implementation of something like this is, you could have come back 3 days later and still gotten it off, right? You didn't need to actually do it in that moment. Maybe you felt like you did. And I would imagine plenty of people like you, Zach, did that. And that's all fine. I wonder about all the people who either know better, have seen that 1,000 other times on the internet, because there's so many copycat things, especially in direct to consumer businesses. So maybe we do something a little bit different there. But also, I think it's a really great opportunity to experiment as well with things like maybe it's different types of discounts. But I'd even go a step further and suggest that, I still get that. I can be a customer of somebody, but because Apple, right, gets rid of cookies after 7 days and I come back through an Apple browser, I might get that again, at which point you've wasted this space. You've clearly signaled you don't actually know who I am. And also, since I already bought, I'm a loyal customer, right? I'm coming back again. So the only reason I bring these things up is not to disparage the quirky, fun aspect of that landing page, but rather because I think sometimes we see a lot of those examples of it's cute and it's up there for the first time, but we're not necessarily thinking about it in the context of who is this person visiting my website right now, or interacting with me on mobile, or calling into the call center, or showing up at an event, right? We have all of these touch points, prospective touch points with a consumer, with a customer. And if we're not thinking about them in the context of when and how and why they're coming to interact with us, we lose a lot of opportunity to make potentially smarter business decisions. Again, maybe I didn't need 15% off and you just gave it away, which cuts into cost, right? That's not necessarily super productive. But also, again, sort of that brand loyalty, that repeat customer energy, right? All these kind of things that we want to tap into can potentially be overlooked by that. And so that is where I think there's just still huge opportunity, frankly, to start with those types of test and learn, maybe show it to 10% of the population before you convert. Play around with a different messaging. You talk about first party and zero party. When I was at Blueconic, we acquired a company called Jebbit, who basically originated the whole concept of zero-party data in 2015, 2016, to do this better, to literally be able to say, we don't need to maybe hit you right out of the gate with a, here's 15% off if you give an email, but rather maybe I can ask what it is that you're here to do and help you find the best product for you. And then 3 or 4 questions later, I've helped you, and now I'm going to ask you for some information, right? Make it a true value exchange. I think a lot of marketers don't maybe put in enough work on the value exchange part of the question and just kind of throw up the landing page and call it a season to get those initial clicks and conversions. And that's where I'd push to think a little bit more strategically and thoughtfully about some of the ways that we can implement that.
One of the companies Zach and I have talked about before is a company called Jolie, which does the like shower filters, new shower heads, and then filters for your shower. And one of the ways that they do what you're talking about, Cory, is they actually have you put in your zip code, and then they send you a report of the water quality in your area, which I think is so smart, where you're talking about that relationship. Well, what can you give me to provide me some information to help me understand why I need to buy this thing? I think that's a great example of that. And Zach and I have seen this. Zach, I'm sure you have some examples to share of like broadband service providers who have done this, where they ask some of those basic questions so that they can think about the personalization piece of this.
Yeah, it's actually, I think, something that's frequently, the history of marketing, for better and for worse, is largely an outbound, right? It was TV. It's a very one-way conversation, which is therefore not a conversation, right? That's just noise. And done really well, that's awesome. But traditional media, whether that was magazines, television, radio, has only been outbound. And I think there's just still a lot of residual muscle from the outbound only dynamic that still informs a lot of how we think about marketing today, which should be conversational. We have the tools to do that. We have the content. A lot of the limiting factors of this before have been in content and messaging. AI is going to help a lot with producing those kinds of things at fairly low cost and accessibly, right? Not some groundbreaking use case, but actually putting those tools out there. But it's really the design of the strategy that is often lacking, where you could say, instead, maybe ask a question first. Maybe that's something that's totally fine to do, and it's okay. And so those are some great examples of places where I'd always like to see marketers, what they might feel is take more risks. I would just suggest it's doing things a little bit differently, but in a way that we actually, frankly, have a lot of very compelling evidence to suggest works not just well to get to the ultimate outcome of a conversion or whatever it is you're going for, but increase brand loyalty, improve the overall customer experience. There's efficacy for all kinds of metrics in terms of how we do this, but it's just not necessarily kind of the way marketing is designed and built and historically measured. But there is a path. There's a better path. We can see that in a lot of places. Just don't necessarily have as much adoption of it as we probably could.
So coming off of this DTC conversation, because I think is a really interesting one, and this is a topic that Zach and I have actually done some podcasts. I actually sent you, Cory, a podcast that we did on this topic, which was our second podcast ever. And I told you, please be kind, because my goodness, that was a long time ago. Hopefully we've improved a little bit since then. But
don't bring it up, Gabe, because now people are going to go look for that episode.
Oh man, I watched like 30 minutes of it, and I just was like, oh God, it's so bad. But hey, it's like anything, right? When you start, you suck, and then hopefully you get a little bit better.
I was going to say, we all have to start somewhere, and
exactly.
The point is starting and getting better, and you're clearly doing that. So we'll celebrate the wins.
Yes, hopefully we can take the W's. So, but the point of that is I think there's a lot of comparisons that we can make between these direct-to-consumer companies and the marketing that they do and broadband service providers. And what I really like about looking at DTC companies is they have to be really, really amazing marketers, because they have a very short period of time to gather interest and get people to stop scrolling and actually focus on what it is that they want to talk about. So I'd love to hear you share, Cory, a little bit about your experiences. I know you've worked in that industry quite a bit. I know there's been a lot of challenges in the DTC space over the last few years, but are there some lessons that we can take there from those businesses that you've seen, kind of in your experience?
For sure. So maybe just start even with what sort of the premise of this is, like, what is an amazing marketer? Or what does it mean to be an amazing marketer? And even that, maybe this is a big deal if we can even answer that question. But my personal point of view, is that amazing marketers generally have a couple of things in common. One is they are kind of the ambassadors of both the customer and the brand, and being able to treat that, whether it's the art and the science, the yin and the yang, whatever, peanut butter and jelly, but like you've got to be really, really fluent and ambassadors of both of those things. You cannot just serve the customer. You cannot also just work in an echo chamber of the brand. Then from there, you need to be very data fluent, right? There's just not a question to be able to do any of this now. Every marketer is a performance marketer, whether you wanted to be one or not. So you can't just be out here designing beautiful creative and not caring where it happens next. So that data fluency is critical. And then agility is another part of this. Like the world just moves too quickly right now to be working in 3, 6, 9, 12-month cycles. We need to be working in hourly cycles, essentially. I mean, that's sort of the ideal here. So if that's kind of the amazing marketer, these ambassadors of brand and of the customer, what I think the D2C companies did really well, and also just want to call out, were born to do, which I think is a very important call out. They were born with the consumer and the brand sort of being a perfect Venn diagram, right? There's no daylight really between those, or very little, which is extraordinarily difficult for a legacy company of any kind who perhaps wasn't born that way, going through a transformation of some kind to make that happen. There's a lot more work here. But being in D2C, one of the early brands there, you really got to have the overlap and bring that to life, which therefore was embodied in the marketing, using the channels that you knew your consumer was going to be on. So a lot of it was the self-fulfilling prophecy. And in fact, one of my favorite reports that I wrote as an analyst at Forrester was on the convergence of brand, marketing, and customer experience, because essentially those three things are all slurried up now into a smoothie and you need to be able to do them all. But I think that's what D2C did really, really extraordinarily well. Where I think you mentioned sort of the challenges, what I think is super instructive, and there's a lot of hope for everyone who wasn't just born to be a D2C company, is that scaling that has been very hard for a lot of those companies. There's obviously economic reasons for that, money not being cheap or free anymore. It was a very expensive now to open stores. But it's actually a pretty traditional retail manufacturing playbook that they now have to figure out how to work through. And knowing your consumer, delivering fabulous, beautiful experiences at scale is really hard. And so they're running into that now. So in that regard, we should all take comfort that they're not going to ever get so far ahead of us, regardless of what industry we're kind of operating in. I think a great example of this, Gabe, that I would just call out is Nike, right? Sort of the perfect blend of traditional brand in a lot of ways, obviously the behemoth in their space. They went full D2C and accelerated that during COVID. That CEO is also a CEO now. And there's a new one who's walking a lot of that back, because there's a recognition that wholesale, discovery, all of these kind of traditional means are really, really critical to the overall Nike success. And so all of which is to say, I think, coming back to some really core business fundamentals around who is our customer, what are we trying to serve them, how do we do that profitably, what does that path look like, and therefore where does marketing layer into that? That is what you are seeing D2C companies now have to reconcile with, perhaps for the first time over the last couple of years, certainly. But then what exactly a lot of our friends in, again, whether it's retail, media, broadband, wherever you are, needing to recalibrate around this, coming back to that core principle I talked about of brand and customer, driving growth and doing that in a profitable way. That's what everyone or most people are grappling with right now in this moment.
One of the key things there, Gabe, I think we have to circle back on is who is our customer? Because with the customers that Gabe and I work with, if you ask that question, it's going to be everyone. Yeah, everyone in our service area is our customer or should be our customer. And oftentimes that's where we kind of see that personalization fall off is, everyone needs the same product and service, which is not quite the case. Gabe, we talk about all the time. And I have the same conversation with my customers. I say, hey, what are your 3 favorite features of the app, for example? And it's always, something different than mine. Again, just going back to the need for personalization there, but continuing that personalization conversation here. One of the things you previously mentioned here was personalization theater. Can you talk to us a little bit about what this means and how businesses can avoid falling into that trap?
Absolutely. So for starters, I've seen this more times. I'm kind of horrified, if I'm honest, by some of that. Basically what we can think of it as is doing the most kind of superficial, basic personalization to a website or to a newsletter, right? Being able to have a newsletter say, Dear Cory, is not particularly impressive. Yes, you've checked the box and maybe it improves click-throughs by 0.01% or something. Good for you, but it's not really needle moving necessarily. And I think that's like kind of best case for some of personalization theater. The worst case, and this is something you guys, we talked about a little bit, is it can be sort of manipulative, if I'm honest. So for example, I worked with a very big brand that you all would know if I said it out loud, who full on admitted that they had sort of consent on their website around data collection and how they would use it. And there was absolutely nothing to back that up. Like it was just the consent language on the site to make sure that, you know, everyone could check a box. Nothing was actually happening there. And then you have, again, sort of the superficial side of it. So what I mean by personalization theater is somebody said we need to do personalization. Nobody clarified what that actually meant. Nobody tied it to specific business outcomes whatsoever. And or they sort of put something in place and then just called it a season. Like, well, we're done. We did that, right? I go back to my previous point. Personalization done well invites a conversation. It is an ongoing, dynamic interaction that extends over the entire customer life cycle, whether that is a matter of days, months, years, quarters, whatever cycles you're working within. Lapsed customers, new customers, these are all folks that are going to have different relationships with your organization, and understanding those different dynamics and how to use what you know to influence that constructively. Going back to the value exchange, that is personalization and well. Personalization theater is when there's just no one behind the curtain. That is really what it is. And most companies, frankly, that's kind of where we're at. Like there's not a lot of sophistication in that. And it's a shame because done well, it's just an extraordinary superpower that can really transform that relationship, make companies much, much more effective. We can talk about examples of that, but like real needle movers when done well. But a lot of folks just don't kind of go that full way. And it's a big missed opportunity, frankly.
As you're explaining this, I had just open up the email app on my phone and I just clicked one of the top 5 emails because I knew how common this would be. And sure enough, the first email I click, hi, Zach. And then the rest of the email, zero personalization. They got my name right, but beyond that, I'm sure every customer in the country got the same email.
Mm-hmm. And it's just not necessary, right? I think that's my point too, is there's so much technology that solves these problems. And I'm also not suggesting that, buy tool XYZ and suddenly, if anything, marketing is overwhelmed by too much technology overhead and running very inefficiently as a result of that. However, we do need to confront the reality that we're only going to see more terrible marketing because of AI, and it's going to require you to be so much smarter and have a very strong relationship with your customers in order not to be caught up in a tidal wave of crap, even if you're not contributing to it. So if anything, before it was a positive needle mover, now it's as much future proofing your brand relationships with your customers as anything else, as the noise gets harder to cut through and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's something that is, we're going to need to bring a lot of human back into this, but we have the tooling to actually do that at scale. And figuring out like that, how that's going to calibrate for your different organizations is going to be a super fun but real challenge.
Yeah. And it's like you said, bringing that human piece in and help, having those real conversations with customers to understand what it is that they truly need. And going back to doing this at scale, to go back to a conversation we were having about the DTC website that Zach looked at earlier, we were talking through around which again, I do, there's a lot of things that I like there, but we talked about this a few weeks ago on another podcast episode where we were talking about choice architecture and smart defaults. And we see a lot of broadband service providers now asking some very simple questions of their customer. Tell me a little bit about yourself, and I can make a smart default into what package, what solution is actually going to be right for you. That probably would have been a good thing for the company that Zach was talking about earlier. What are Zach's needs? They're going to be very different from my needs. I've got to worry about my wife and what her needs are too. Zach's just, off living his life all by himself, right? So he can do whatever the heck he wants. But asking some of those simple questions can make sure that you're getting somebody the right option in that purchase process, and giving them, again, that smart default. In our business, obviously, people want to buy, they want customers buying the higher end service tiers because that's what drives more revenue. That's what drives more ARPU. But that may not necessarily be the best option for everybody. And if you click through the personalization, and I'll use your personalization theater thing there, Cory, if you click through all of those options and you always get the same answer, that's a perfect example of personalization theater.
Absolutely.
We see that crap a lot, man. We see that a lot.
Yeah, no, it's such a good example. And look, this is such a dumb heuristic, but I think it works. If you would not do this, if you were face to face with someone, then you can't do it when you do it in technology. Like if you were going to sit down with me at a table, right, and have the same question, and then my husband comes down and sits down next, and then a friend comes in and they're all getting the same answer, and the three of us are going to go talk about it after, you would never do that. You'd never let someone in a branch or an office do that kind of thing. So you can't let the technology do that as well. And it's so self-serving, and yet backfires, because what you'll end up with is you're thinking too much about one singular outcome at the expense of a more holistic way of looking at it. So, right, I come from software, but a great example of this, right, one of our North Star metrics is the CAC to LTV ratio, the customer acquisition cost to the lifetime value. Lifetime value, though, if you have a 5-year or 10-year, 50-year, whatever you're working with customer, it might be worth to spend a little more money up front to get them to that. And potentially, to your point, Gabe, maybe we start them at one place and we ramp them up. But and I've said this before, the CMO and the CFO should be best friends, right? The degree of financial modeling, I think finance often is like, I don't know, just cut the marketing budget. We'll figure it out later, right? It's such an easy one because it feels so discretionary. It should be the growth engine of the company. And if that's easy to do, then there isn't enough sophistication in that partnership. But that helps us answer these questions, is what can we be looking at longer term? What's the health of the company? But if we're looking at either very different and or very distinct metrics within the C-suite and then their sort of functional organizations, you end up with these situations where it's like, you know what, marketing only job is to get people to convert the first time we see them on the website. Zach, in your case, you bought the sheets, like check. But what about the 10 people who didn't, or the people who are coming back, so on and so forth? So that's where that kind of bigger comprehensive agreement needs to be brought into play, because it actually can be very costly. You just may not see it up front, right? It may be a price that you pay later on down the road. If you can't answer that for sure, then probably you need to go back down and sit with finance and be figuring some of those metrics out and how they all play together for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm sort of a lunatic about lifetime value, and especially in our business, because most of the customers that we work with have very low churn rates. Our customers work in a recurring revenue business. Mm-hmm. So every month that money is coming out of their bank account, right? So churn percentage becomes a really important metric for everybody to track. And what we see is that a lot of times our customers will have, on average, relationships for 6, 7, 8, sometimes even longer number of years. But they're not thinking about it in that lifetime value, from that lifetime value lens, and then really bringing it back to the customer acquisition cost portion of that and comparing those two metrics. I've done analysis with customers in the past where we've looked at what their customer acquisition cost is and how much lifetime value. And I was like, you know what? You probably actually need to be spending more money, because there's latent demand here that you're not capturing because Absolutely. You're not investing enough from a marketing operation OpEx perspective. And that's, I think, a really great point you bring up there of CMO and CFO being best friends, because that's where you, as the CMO, if you can go back and have that really intelligent conversation to say, look, we're seeing that this massive demand for our products. And, if we made a few more investments here, we could actually probably be picking up even more customers. That's a really different conversation versus, can I have 10% more in my budget this year, please?
Totally. Also totally revealed yourself as a recovering finance guy with the OpEx comment. So well done there. But yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I think this is also, again, like, marketing is often either left out of those conversations or sometimes chooses not to be in the room for those conversations. And if we're trying to kind of strategically drive growth here, it's another one to look at. So churn, I think, is a great one. Downsell is another one. You know, if you're getting everyone right into the top tier, but it was too much for them and they're downselling, now you kind of have, that's kind of a crappy feeling, right? You
100%.
probably over-service them as well. So there are all of these kind of thoughtful questions that, going back to my point about kind of being the ambassador for the brand and the customer, if you think about that a little bit differently, the business and the customer, figuring out what that intersection looks like and putting the hard numbers behind it with finance, and then being aligned around what is it we're trying to drive here, knowing we can't drive everything. We'll pick the most important ones, but just being really clear about what those are and then how that will work from the customer and customer experience side. Like, that is the fundamental responsibility, in my view, of amazing marketers, to your characterization earlier.
Yeah, for sure. And Zach and I talk about this a lot because Zach's nerdy like me and minored in was it finance or accounting, Zach? I think it was accounting. Yeah.
I mean, I'm a couple classes shy, but it was one of those close enough that I know enough to be dangerous now. But
there you go.
Gabe, as soon as we started talking about cost of acquisition, I knew exactly.
You just saw
where
my
this
eyes
podcast
light
was
up.
going. Oh yeah, I don't think we've told Cory what my license plate is, by the way. But that's a finance discussion for another time.
I need to know. Now I need to know.
Well, we actually started the prep for this podcast talking about Excel and how much time Gabe and I either spend or invest in the program. So my license plate is actually XLSX. So that's way the nerdiest license plate in my state.
You're the nerdiest person I've ever met, except for the fact that now is a good time to tell you that my license plate is Dumbledore. So DMBLDR. So I'm just a nerd on a totally different part of the discipline. So nerd on nerd violence here. I love it. Let's go.
I feel bad, but I have not seen all/any of the Harry Potter movies, so I know the reference, but that will be no surprise to Gabe. That's the mic drop. But hey, we do have a few minutes. Yeah, we do have a few minutes left though. And Gabe, I want to kind of toss it back to you here for our last topic here.
Sounds good.
And that's just the practical and tactical advice for our listeners to kind of take away from the episode.
Yeah, I as we kind of wrap things up here, Cory, one of the things that Zach and I really try and focus on is that, and I feel like we've talked about a lot of this through the podcast. But just to kind of wrap this up, that those key takeaways, that tactical advice, that practical advice, we really want people to come away from our podcast with a few things that they can, hopefully write down and actually take back to the day to day. So, if you had to choose one or two areas from a lot of the things that we talked about today to focus on for kind of most bang for the buck, so to speak, which would those be, and where would you kind of recommend people start?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this practical thing. So the first thing I would say, because I tend to go back to kind of looking at history to see what we're doing forward, and I just think it's very timely. There was an article from the late 1960s that McKinsey published called "The Changing Face of Marketing," and just last week they published a new article about how the CMOs, called the CMOs Comeback, aligning the C-suite to drive customer-centric growth. And I just say that because part of this can feel very overwhelming, but the same core principles of what was driving marketing and what was required of CMOs in 1960s is still the type of conversation we're having here in 2026 or 2025. Not to get ahead of ourselves. But I think
we'll be there before we know it.
I know. Tell me about it. So I think part of that is like being able to kind of compare and contrast what is new, sure. But a lot of this is just really solid, proven fundamentals that probably anyone listening to this, them, you've learned them, you've lived them, probably a combination. So start there. The two things that I would say, like just sort of starting with what you know, and in the organization, allowing one of the objectives to be building up the muscle to do what we're talking about. This is not a light switch type of conversation. This is not go out and buy a tool. This is not go out and have one meeting with the CFO and we're done here. This is about building the muscle for amazing marketing across the organization. So if you're the leader, how do you make more amazing marketers like we talked about? What is your role in doing that? And then if you are kind of rank and file marketers, the doers out there getting it done, where do you fit into this? How do you either help train yourself, get budget for experiments? Maybe it's moving budget around, doesn't always need to be new budget, but this agility and making a case for how brand and customer are what you are doing and delivering on every day. Not everything's going to be gold. It's not all going to work, but every bit that you learn and continue to build that muscle, that's really ultimately going to be what transforms an organization. There's no endpoint to transformation. It's every day, right? You keep going and going and going. So that's kind of broad picture. The two like very, very specific things though, aside from that meeting with the CFO, if you're a senior marketer, one is when you think about your channel mix of how you're doing marketing today, pick one to do experiments in. So just reallocating budget, if you do have incremental budget because things are going well, whatever. Dollars tell the truth. What you put your money toward is what matters to your organization. So figure out how to spend some money on the initiatives that we're talking about, doing some of the experimentation, trying out new personalization, whatever that looks like. So that's one, making a case for that. The second one is a data audit. I think we've talked about this, particularly in broadband. There's a lot of customer data, actually. Maybe you don't necessarily know it, but really doing the work to do basically a data dictionary around what data do we have about our customers? Where does it live? How often is it updated? Who owns it? What permissions do we have to use it? You may have a lot of data, but it's actually not allowed to be used for marketing. Then you don't have that data for all intents and purposes. So doing a data audit, which usually can take somewhere between 3 and 6 months, depending on the size of the organization. So you really have a great grasp on who your customers are and what your permissions are to use that data. Then you start to get into that choice architecture. What can we use? How will we use it? Being really thoughtful there. But you need to have that kind of Magna Carta of like, this is what we're working off of. This is the truth here. And then you can kind of build from there. So those are my big ones. If you're a CMO, meet with the CFO. For everybody else, picking that one direct channel and getting some budget mixed around to experiment there and doing a data audit. So you really know what your customer data is and what you're working with. Those are my two practical recommendations.
I love all that. I'm gonna top up one thing you said here, and this CMO CFO conversation and experimenting. One of the things I always encourage people to do too is, if you're going to have that conversation with the CFO and you're going to start to build this relationship, if you're the marketing person in an organization, you have to talk about both successes and failures, because you brought up a really great point. Not everything is going to be a winner. And it's so important to say, look, we tried this and it didn't work out, but these are the things that we learned from it that we're going to do in a different way. And if you stop at the first half of that conversation of, we tried this and it didn't work, but you don't follow up with the second half of that conversation of, and this is what we're going to do different to make it better next time, then trust is lost, right? But if you're building that relationship with the other folks in your organization, that can be a great way to build that trust, is to say, look, this was a failure, or this didn't work out this specific time. But again, it's that constant learning and constant transformation, as you said, right? It's a continuous thing. It's not just okay, well, we've transformed and now we can chill, right? There's none of that.
And so, you use such an critical word that I think trust here is both the internal and the external. I've been very fortunate to work with one of the authors of the Trusted Advisor, who wrote this book with the trust equation. If you don't know it, look it up. It's amazing. But like, what leads to really good trust? And it's credibility, reliability, and intimacy divided by self-interest. And so being able to build that and have that North Star internally, if you're a practitioner, but also with customers, how do you show up for them? Why are you credible at what you're doing? Earning that over time, and continuing to earn it over time is just such a crucial piece of this. Again, something that personalization theater does not help you do, I can assure you. But yeah, I love that word, and it's such an important kind of principle to come back to when we think about this, not necessarily the specific tactics, but the principles we're trying to get to. Trust is so underlying foundation of all of that. I totally agree.
Well, Cory, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We might have to have you back for another episode. Gabe, what are we thinking here?
I feel like we got a lot of meat on this bone still that we could dig into. So yeah,
I'm ready. Although you're going to have either read or watched Harry Potter before I do that.
we've got
I'm just declaring it. No.
We've got a to-do list, so I will make some progress on that. But Cory, thank you again for joining us today on Buffering, and thank you for everyone for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to give us a follow on your favorite podcast app and to share it with your friends and colleagues. And for more insights, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn.